We'll just start with verses 18 through 20. Servants. And we should stop there. This is a word for slaves. So sometimes it's translated as servants. I'm reading from the English Standard Version. It's referring to slaves. So slaves, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. For this is a gracious thing when, mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it if, when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? But if, when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. So, the first phrase there, slaves, be subject to your masters. It's that phrase that's caused a lot of people a lot of questions. And it's caused a lot of questions partially because of people like James Shannon, who was a preacher back in the mid-1800s. I think he was Baptist, if I remember correctly. And I was reading a book, and not even for this lesson, but I happened upon this quote from him. He was talking about the verses like this in the Bible that, in his opinion, endorsed slavery. And he said, if the Bible be true, to denounce slavery as being essentially criminal is to blaspheme God by pronouncing sentence of condemnation on his statutes and making him the author of sin. Now, if you caught what he was doing there, he was using verses like this from the New Testament to justify the slavery that was in our country 150 years ago when he was speaking. So he's using verses like this to cause harm to a lot of people. And so that's not a unique example at all. I'm sure you could find even more offensive examples, just one I happened upon. So uses like that cause us maybe to question, at least a lot of people, to question why Peter doesn't go farther here. Why doesn't he at least criticize this institution? Because on an immediate level, if you've ever been in a situation where you are enduring injustice that maybe you feel like could be changed, it can feel like colluding with evil just to put your head down and put up with it. It can feel like you're just joining in on whatever the devil is doing in your situation. There are lots of violent households and abusive workplaces that are just allowed to continue unchecked because nobody wants to blow that whistle, right? Because it's sometimes easier not to stick your head out and risk losing your job or your home or even your life, right? So there's a lot of sin that continues because of ideas about or like this, where we submit to what happens. And you would think that if Peter is writing the Bible, right, the Bible that has caused or has ruled over much of human life over the past 2,000 years, you might think that he should say something stronger to the injustice that these slaves are enduring. Maybe you don't feel that, but maybe you will after we talk about the situation for just a moment. So slavery was foundational to the Roman Empire. It's somewhere between 20 and 35% of all of the people who lived in the Roman Empire were slaves. So either 1/5 or 1/3 of the people of the empire were slaves. Specifically in the towns to which Peter's writing, he's writing to a group of churches, and in their towns, probably somewhere between 5 and 30% of the people were slaves. 5 on the very low end, and somewhere probably around 20% would have been average for these towns. So 1 out of every 5 people in these towns is a slave. So it's not like this is a tiny population. It's a very significant part of the population. And it's because pretty much everything that electricity and gas and engines do in our world was done by slaves in the first century. They made the world run. Again, they're foundational to the empire. So slavery in their day, it wasn't based on race like the slavery in our country was. It was based on birth, mainly. If you were born into a slave family, then you were a slave. Second, the second most common way to enter into slavery back then was through war. If your nation lost in war and you are taken into captivity by your conquering nation, you could be made a slave. Some people got into debt, and so they had to sell themselves into slavery to help pay off that debt. Some people got into slavery because there was a phenomenon in the first century where when a baby was born and a mom or the parents didn't want to keep the baby, it was a form of abortion, it was called exposure. They would just leave the baby outside on the street or on a pile of trash. They just leave the baby, and the baby would either die or it would be picked up, oftentimes, by a slave owner, who would then either take the baby as their own or sell the baby off. So there are different ways that people got into slavery back then. The last one I'll mention is legal punishment. Sometimes if you committed a crime that was serious enough, your sentence was to become a slave for a certain amount of time or for the rest of your life. So there are several ways that this happened, not race-based like ours again, but several ways. And so it's different from the pre-20th century Southern antebellum slavery of our country. And that has caused a lot of people to minimize this slavery, to say that it's different, therefore it's not as bad. But historically speaking, the slavery of their world was no more humane than ours. Slaves had no rights. They could not be married. They could not have a family. They could not own property. Of course, they could have family bloodlines, but they couldn't legally be counted as part of a family. They were viewed as overgrown children. That was just how they were viewed in that world. If they were called upon to testify in court, their testimony wouldn't be valid unless it was tested by torture. So a slave had to be tortured in order to testify in court. Otherwise, their testimony wasn't valid. Children born into slavery didn't belong to their parents. They belonged to the master. So there's no family, there's no property. The masters could do essentially anything that they wanted to slaves. And so slaves were flogged, they were shackled, they were branded on their face, they walked around in iron collars, they were dismembered and maimed, and frequently, maybe the worst experience, frequently sexually abused. So there's so many terrible things that are happening to these slaves. And if you were a slave and you got tired of it, and you had enough, and you were going to take out your master, to assassinate your master, when you did that, not only would you suffer the penalty, you would suffer the legal penalties, but also every other slave that master had would suffer the penalty. And every slave who had been freed, who had previously belonged to that master, would suffer the penalty. And the most common penalty is familiar to us, crucifixion. So if you went that route, you and all of the other slaves that have ever belonged to this master would be crucified as a penalty. Now, I've been painting the negative picture, I think rightfully so. But if you did luck out in terms of having a more, as Peter says, good and gentle master, then slavery could be a type of redemption, ironically, in their world. As their world didn't have the types of checks and balances that ours does. There weren't food stamps or government programs like that. And so slavery, at least in theory, could be a way where all of your basic needs are provided by the master. So in that way, it was almost a salvation from complete desolation. But that's just about the only positive spin. Some people actually would sell themselves into slavery in order to receive even that level of security because they were so desperate. But we can't say that this was in any way really a positive experience. Here, in 1 Peter 2, the word that he uses for translated servants or slaves specifically refers to household slaves. So they were field slaves and household slaves, and these are the household slaves. And these slaves were often pretty highly educated. They were physicians even, and librarians, and musicians, and stewards, and teachers. And frequently, these types of slaves, if they were in an urban environment in the city, could expect to be freed by the time they turned 30. So there was hope, especially for the household slaves in view, that they'd be free by the time they turned 30. But you have to remember that 30 in AD 25 is not the 30 of AD 2025. Their life expectancy was far lower than ours. So it's maybe not the same as our world, but they at least did have this hope for freedom. Freedom in their world wasn't what you and I might think of as freedom. They were still indebted to their former master, and they had to work for him a certain amount of days each year, but relatively free. One more layer onto this as I'm trying to paint this picture of slavery in that world. Christian slaves face particular hazards because of their faith. Because slaves were expected to have the same religion as their master, to worship the same gods as their master. So if you're a slave and you become a Christian and your master does not become a Christian, then this is going to create some tension in the household. This is against societal expectations. And especially if your master asks some questions or looks into this whole Christian thing and he finds out that they're talking about freedom in Christ and they're talking about another superior master for every human on earth. So you can see how things like that might have caused some tension in the households of a slave who becomes a Christian. So that's kind of the situation into which Peter is speaking. And I want to offer some thoughts. And these are not going to be exhaustive thoughts, and I don't anticipate that if you have questions about this, that it's going to end the conversation, but I hope it at least can begin one. I hope that we can walk away with at least some understanding as to why Peter might have written something like this. First of all, the first reminder is that we are reading someone else's mail. This is important anytime we pick up the Bible, to remember that we are reading, in 1 Peter's case, a letter that is written from Peter to churches in Asia Minor in that day and time. So it's not written to, for instance, James Shannon, the person who used texts like this to abuse other humans. It's not written to him. Of course, it has power and wisdom in their day and in our day. Of course, it has that. But we have to remember that we're reading an ancient document that was written from and to people in a world that's very different from ours. In particular, no one in this room is a slave, right? So that's already you're not directly addressed when he says, slaves, submit to your masters. None of that particularly is about you and me. Also, even more particularly, none of us were already slaves and then became Christians and now have to figure out what we're going to do with all of this, right? So this is a particular situation that he's writing into. And again, there's wisdom and power for our lives. But before we just pick it up and read it and assume that we understand everything that he's saying, it's important to remember what we're reading. It's not a bat that is put into the master's hands to subjugate other people, right? That's not what this is. This is a letter that's written to oppressed people who don't have any recourse. It's written to help them to navigate this complicated situation. Because the whole establishment that they're facing for the first century Roman Empire is enormous, right? And trying to change that is kind of like being tasked with climbing a 5-mile high block of stainless steel where you just look at it and you're like, how in the world am I going to change something this gigantic? I think that's important to remember when we read something like this. It's written to a community on the fringes of that society without power. Understanding that if they were to try to take on this cultural injustice head on, probably would have led to the crucifixion of any slaves involved and the extermination of the Christian community that was involved. So it's more complicated than it might seem in our world of free speech and democracy and that kind of thing. At the same time, I think it's important to say that any of these thoughts that I offer, there are other thoughts that you could offer that would be contrary, that might challenge what I'm saying. For instance, with this, you could say, okay, so the institution of slavery was foundational to the empire, and so it'd be a gigantic challenge to try to undermine it. Makes sense? But aren't we talking about the same God who just raised Jesus from the dead, and the same God who performed these incredible miracles in the Old Testament and in the New Testament? And if you said that, I would say, good point. We could keep talking about it. So I bring that up to say these points are not meant to be conclusive, but I hope to help us think through this. So in light of the cultural weight that they're facing, Peter accommodates to their culture, to their society. But he also subverts the cultural norms. So he does a few surprising things here. First of all, you'll notice we mentioned that slaves were expected to be the same religion as their masters. Now, Peter doesn't expect that, right? He doesn't assume that. He actually expects and teaches and assumes that they could be a different religion from their masters. He assigns them that dignity, that freedom. Also, notice that he addresses slaves directly. He talks directly to them. Now, what Peter's doing here, and he moves on from here next to talk about wives and different portions of the household in the letter. What he's doing is a common thing in the ancient world. They had what we call household codes, and they would talk about how each person in the household was expected to act in their station And so this is a common thing, but it's very uncommon for slaves to be addressed in this type of address. It's very uncommon for Peter to speak to them. And so not only does he address them directly, he actually engages and offers this extended line of reasoning, right? He goes on from here, and in verses 19 and 20, and then verses 21 through 25, he offers extended reasons for why he suggests this line of action. And so he's assuming their rational competence and their moral their moral standards that they must withhold or uphold, their Christian commitments. He's assuming things about them that the ancient world in general would not have assumed, because they viewed slaves more as possession, less as person. Slaves were possessions, not persons. And so they don't have rights. And this is another surprising, subversive thing that Peter does. Notice he speaks of this suffering as being unjust. You see that? He says that this suffering is unjust. Aristotle, who was obviously a super influential philosopher in the ancient world, and many of his ideals continued through Jesus' day, he said that a slave could not endure injustice because, as a possession and not a person, they could not endure injustice. You couldn't do something wrong to a thing. So that was his position. That was the position of much of the ancient world, even through Peter's day. But Peter says no. These slaves are people with the same human rights and dignity as anyone else has. So they can suffer injustice. So there are these little nuances that are calling this entire social order into question. It's both accommodation and subversion. And I think the reason why Peter's going on both of those routes, why he's walking this tightrope between the two, is because his main goal in this text is what we would call apologetic. And you've maybe heard of apologetics press, of different things like that. An apologetic is just a defense, right? It's a Greek word, apologia, which means to defend. So he's making a defense of his message here. And in particular, he's trying to set up these slaves and the other people to whom he's writing to act in a way that advances the gospel. So that seems to be his main goal here. Because the ancient world viewed an orderly household as the basis of a prosperous society. So they expected the man to be the head of the house, with the wife significantly under him, and with children and with slaves. It was a very defined structure to their household. So new religions that were introduced by foreigners, and that's Christianity this time, right? It's a new religion introduced by a foreigner. So they were judged largely by whether or not they withheld or upheld, that's twice I've said that, they've upheld the standard cultural household roles. So that was one of the main ways in which new religions were judged. So I think Peter has that in mind here when he says, slaves, be submissive. Understand that there is a bigger goal in mind here. And I think that is tough to swallow for a lot of us. And I think maybe it's because contrariness and defiance and disrespect can become celebrated in our culture. Just being defiant for the sake of being defiant, being mean just to be mean, can become celebrated in our culture. But those aren't the way of love, and therefore they're not the way of Jesus. Submission can actually be a voluntary expression of freedom. Choosing to submit can be the path of freedom, not just giving in. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 19 that though I am free from all, I have made myself a slave to all in order that I might win more of them. In other words, Paul says that he's giving up his rights in order to advance a cause that he believes in. He believes in the cause of this gospel. And so he's giving up some of his rights to advance it. And of course, this principle that I'm talking about right now can be and has been taken in some incredibly harmful directions. So it's not about justifying oppression or anything like idolizing passivity, anything like that. But sometimes the most loving route for me to take is not to exercise my full rights, right? This is what it means in part to be a parent. You don't exercise your full rights because you care about this child. Maybe you have a right to leave your toddler at home and go have a dinner off to yourself, but you probably don't, partially because you don't want to come back to a torn-apart house, but also because you mainly care about that toddler, right? You care about that child more than you care about your night off. So that's what it means to be a parent. It's what it means to be a friend. When you're a friend, sometimes you have to take a call at 3 a.m. that you really would just prefer to be sleeping through, right? It's what it means to just be a human in a society. It means what it means to be a Christian in a church. You have to give up some of your rights for the betterment of the group as a whole. And so that's not to say that Christians never cause a stir. In fact, the Christian message itself is inherently subversive because it says that this slave to whom Peter's writing is both free and equal, just as free and just as equal as anyone else in Christ. Peter says, if you're there in 1 Peter 2, look at verse 16. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as slaves of God. So we are free, spiritually speaking. But also, Paul says in Galatians chapter 3 that there is no slave and free. There's no male and female, Jew or Greek in Christ, that we're all one in Christ. So these are subversive beliefs, especially in the ancient world. And historically speaking, the past 2,000 years have seen that those beliefs have changed our world. You may have heard the name Tom Holland. To some of you, that is a preacher who passed away in the past few years that you've heard of. Some of you think with that name, you think of the actor Tom Holland, who is Spider-Man. So there are a couple Tom Hollands. There's a third Tom Holland you might not have heard of before. He is a famous historian, but also, if you're a historian, there are levels probably to the fame that you can achieve. But for a historian, he is famous. And he wrote in his book, Dominion, he's not a Christian, but he wrote in his book that every human being possessed in equal dignity was not a remotely self-evident truth. A Roman would have laughed at it. A Roman would have laughed at the idea that every human possesses an equal dignity. He goes on to say, the origins of this principle lay not in the French Revolution, nor in the Declaration of Independence, nor in the Enlightenment, but in the Bible. So historically speaking, he argues that the Bible and then the subsequent Christian movement changed the world, that even just that basic principle that we hold so dear of the equal rights and dignity of each human comes from the Bible, comes from this Christian movement, that little pockets of people, very much like us, who are being transformed by Christ, then transformed our world over the course of 2,000 years. Now, of course, I think it's also important to acknowledge that many Christians have committed unspeakable evils against fellow humans. But Christians, at their best, are not an inquisition, they're not a crusade. They look like the cross, because that's what Jesus looked like. That's how Jesus carried himself. There's stories of the early Christians when it comes to the issue of slavery. There's stories of the early Christians picking up those babies who were exposed in the streets, just left in the streets or on the trash dump. Stories of Christians who picked up those babies and adopted them, not to be slaves, but to be their own children. There's stories of Christians buying slaves out of slavery with their own money, purchasing them and letting them go free. There are other stories that are really just beautiful stories of people selling, sadly beautiful stories, of people selling themselves into slavery because someone else needed the money so badly. So they would sell themselves into slavery in order to give that money to this person who needed it. There are these beautiful cross-shaped acts of compassion, of love, of grace, of justice, of justice in the face of tremendous injustice that the Christian movement brought into this world. So that's what being a Christian at its best looks like, because that's what Jesus looked like. And if we're going to follow and worship and pledge our allegiance to this crucified God, then it's going to subvert the politics of might makes right of our world to its very core, just like Jesus. Just like Jesus. So I think as we come to a text like this, I don't say this to challenge so much the questions that we might have reading this, but I say it to make myself look in the mirror, because it's easy to look at an ancient document like this one and to look down at our noses at the ancient world with the slaves that were all around, without realizing that in many parts of our own supposedly free society, there are people who suffer similarly. There are people who are often hidden from view, working long hours for minimal wages. They don't have time because they continue to work, to take time off or to look for another job. And even if they were to lose one day's wages, much less lose their entire job, they'd be destitute with families to support. It'd be disastrous. So they're stuck in this situation. So if we want to sneer at the ancient world for their problems, they might want to be careful because they might just sneer right back. And I bring that up to say that the example of the Christians in that world of, among other things, adopting those babies, of buying slaves out of slavery, of selling themselves into slavery in order to give that money away, those acts of love are just as necessary in our world, that we are called to follow in the path of Jesus just as much as they were. I want to read together verses 21 through 25 of 1 Peter 2, and then we'll begin to wrap it up with some thoughts for us. Beginning in verse 21, "For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. For you were straying like sheep, but have now returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls." I think for me, the key to a lot of this and a lot of questions like the one that we're focusing on tonight is the idea that the crucifixion of Jesus is the most unjust deed that the world has ever experienced. This is a man who never hurt a fly. This is God. And he's spit on and beat up and tortured to death, though he was completely innocent. And to make sense of those events, to help to grasp how something like that could make sense in a world like ours, Peter turns to the Old Testament here. He turns to Isaiah 53, from what Jason read for us this morning. He quotes and alludes several times in the verses we just read to Isaiah 53. And that chapter in Isaiah talks about a royal servant, a royal slave, who actually, through his unjust suffering, heals the world. He heals everything that's wrong and broken and unjust in the world through his own suffering. So I think in light of that, we can say that Peter's not just recommending that we passively watch as the evil in the world passes us by. He actually believes that the suffering of Jesus is not only about spiritual salvation for all of us. It is about that. But he also believes that it can bring salvation to our world right here and right now. That if we follow in the steps of Jesus, we follow in the steps of the cross, that we can bring the same healing that Jesus did to our little communities, that to Little Rock, to Mableville, to Bryant, to Benton, that we can bring healing right here and right now if we follow in this cross-shaped path. For Peter, the cross is the point around which the whole world revolves. And so he sees the suffering, the unjust suffering of God's people as being wrapped up in the suffering of the Son of God. That suffering is somehow one with the sufferings of the Christ. So when we read this, we're not just reading for the slaves that are addressed. We are reading for them, but we're reading for all of us. There are multiple reasons to say that, but one reason is that, like I said, this was a common form of writing in the ancient world, household codes. Slaves, very rarely mentioned, but when they were always at the back. They were never put in the front. But Peter starts with the slaves. He begins at the lowest tier of their society. And then also, in this section, he ties together themes from all over this letter. All over 1 Peter, there are themes tied together right here in verses 18 to 25. So those two things, that he starts with slaves and that he ties together all these themes, seem to tell us that the reason why he starts with these slaves, the reason why you and I should care, in a special way, what he says to these slaves, is because they are examples of what we are called to be. because their unjust suffering in our world exemplifies for us how we are called to live. That because we are called to follow him, we're called to follow them. That they suffer, just like the suffering servant of Isaiah. These servants are suffering. And so are we, that we're called to live like them. And in verse 16, he calls all of us slaves, that we're called to have this mindset in our lives, to take in the injustice of our world, and no matter how we respond to it, to do it with the posture of the cross. So in the end, I think what Peter does here is not just a passive endorsement of what's wrong in their world, and it's also not a political manifesto. It's not a call to arms. It's a reimagining of agency and dignity and humanity in the shadow of the cross. That how Jesus died and lived again actually changes how we view each other. That we can't look down at each other as being less worth that sacrifice, because this servant died for all of us in the death of a slave, the death of the cross. For some of us, this text may still be unsettling, especially in a world that continues to suffer from similar economic exploitation and other things that are wrong, similar to their world. But Peter dares to claim that this ethic can be a quiet, radical witness to a different type of world. That we, as different types of people, can introduce to our world a different type of world. A world in which might doesn't necessarily make right, in which a cross is greater than a crown, in which I'm not the king of my life, but Jesus is. So tonight, if you would like to follow that king in his path of servitude and suffering, won't you do it as we stand and sing together?